The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been working on an initiative called Engineering with Nature. It all started in 2010. And this is the EWN Podcast. EWN is developing and implementing nature-based solutions for water and infrastructure projects. It's bringing together a growing international community of scientists, engineers, and researchers from all kinds of disciplines that are committed to harnessing the power of nature to solve problems. The EWN Podcast tells their stories. Now here's your host, Sarah Thorne of Decision Partners.
Today, our guest is a scientist and an innovator who brings new thinking and new applications of nature-based solutions into her work. Well, every day. With climate change advancing, she joined the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers over 3 years ago because she thought it was there that she could make the biggest difference. Welcome to Season 7, Episode 3. I'm here with Jeff King, lead of the Engineering with Nature program, and Julie Beagle, who's the Environmental Planning Section Chief for the Army Corps of Engineers San Francisco District. First, I'll say, hey, welcome, Jeff. Maybe you could offer a few words about Julie and why we were so excited about having her as a guest on the podcast.
Absolutely. Well, we've been looking forward to this conversation for a very long time. Julie's leadership on Engineering with Nature has been absolutely outstanding, and her passion for bringing nature-based solutions to address a whole range of projects in San Francisco Bay and really throughout the district is inspiring. She's truly moving the needle when it comes to advancing practice with integration of nature-based solutions. So Julie, welcome to the EWN Podcast.
Wow, thanks for having me. It's such an honor to be here. I'm really looking forward to this.
Julie, let's start by talking a little bit about your background and what led you to join the Army Corps of Engineers and really become a champion for engineering with nature.
So I started out as a field scientist, just in the rivers all day, every day. I found a job that let me be outside and do science, and that's where I started. So I'm a geomorphologist, which is the science of sediment and water and how that shapes the surface of the earth. And so that's really about rivers, landslides, how water and dirt interact. So my early career was focused on protecting salmonid species. It was really driven by the Endangered Species Act, helping communities restore rivers in far northern and sort of central northern California, thinking about how to manage the landscape differently, to protect and integrate habitats. And then I started working my way downstream into more engineered flood control channels, and the issues changed about water quality and the interaction of land use and development. And at some point over the last 15 years, climate change just became the driver. It really was about how are these landscapes going to adapt and how are people going to adapt and our species and ecosystems to this just completely changed reality that we're facing.
And it's fair to say you really changed your perspective and the focus of your work.
I made my way down into the estuary, and all of a sudden the water started to move two directions, not just one direction. And it was mind-blowing, and then you turn around and you look upstream and the whole watershed connects. What happens at the upper watershed influences what happens on the alluvial fans, on the floodplains, down into the tidal marshes and down into the bay and the outer ocean. And it really helped me understand this entire landscape that we have modified and are now having to adapt for all the benefits that we need out of our ecosystems and lands, the recreation it provides, the habitat, all of the interaction that we have with water. So we can't do this in a piece by piece way. It really has to come from a landscape approach, and that really resonates with engineering with nature. And so I first heard about engineering with nature many years ago when the term was coined, and it started at the Army Corps. And I thought, that's what we're trying to do: process-based restoration, manage the landscape holistically with communities. And it felt like the Army Corps was the place to really move the needle, as Jeff said.
So, Julie, can you talk a bit about what you were doing before you came to the Corps?
I spent the last 10 years before coming to the Army Corps working with cities, counties, flood control districts, helping them understand their water resources challenges and plan for integrating nature-based solutions. If every individual landowner or flood control district or wastewater treatment plant has to make these decisions on their own, it's inequitable. It means the communities that have money are able to move forward and adapt, and it means the communities without are the ones who are going to continue to be flooded. And so to me, the Army Corps is this huge organization that has the power and scope and breadth to think at a landscape scale, which is what we know we need. And so I took the leap and came over to the team, and I'm so happy that I did.
Well, we're glad you did, Julie. And I want to say how much I appreciate that description. Just everything you said rings true. Totally agree with your perspective. And just this idea of systems level thinking, the idea of needing to take a more holistic approach really is fundamental to engineering with nature.
Julie, you have talked about how important it is to put all these things into perspective. And we want to talk to you about the work that you're doing, the kind of projects you're doing, the engineering with nature projects you're doing. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about one of the things that you did, which, as Jeff knows, you were the lead author on a publication called the San Francisco Bay Shoreline Adaptation Atlas, Working with Nature to Plan for Sea Level Rise Using Operational Landscape Units. And this was published in 2019, I think just before you came to the Corps. When I looked at that, I thought what was really remarkable about this framework was that it helps communities identify different adaptation strategies to take advantage of natural processes. So can you talk a little bit about that and how this adaptation framework is helping to address some of the big challenges that you're facing in San Francisco Bay Area?
Sure. So for years and years working here in San Francisco Bay, this idea of nature-based solutions was starting to gain traction. Living shorelines, there's a lot of interest in softening the shoreline. But there wasn't a lot of guidance on it. There's a lot of guidance on riprap and trapezoidal channels. And there has not been, although it's changed dramatically in the last 5 years, there hadn't been a lot of guidance on where and how and what types of nature-based features are appropriate. Because, we can't have mangroves in San Francisco Bay. Those are a really good tool in southeast of this country. But in our Mediterranean climate, it's a really different set of tools and types of nature-based features. And so that geographically specific guidance, recommendations on what types of nature-based opportunities there are was pretty much missing. So there was a lot of interest from both regulatory agencies, from communities, from cities, from parks districts. And so we thought, we could do that, but it really makes sense to think about the shoreline as a watershed. Like, we understand watershed boundaries. That's something that's been very common practice. But once you get into the flatlands down by the water, where we've changed the way sewers drain and stormwater, and it's a lot flatter, we kind of lost that definition. And so we thought, is there a scale at which adaptation makes sense so that each community is not going at parcel by parcel?
And I understand San Francisco Bay had some unique challenges.
What's different about San Francisco Bay is that, unlike other coastlines, it's not kind of single family properties along the shoreline. It's wastewater treatment plants, landfills, highways. It's industrial land uses, ports, and then there's parts that are residential, but there's some scale at which adaptation makes sense. And that's kind of was the purpose of pairing those two approaches together. And it's really resonated. It has helped communities figure out who do they need to talk to. If I'm a city, I need to talk to the city just north of me and probably the Parks District and the Flood Control Channel. And so it has spawned these kind of organic working groups that have popped up all over the Bay, supported by this atlas, because they can say, okay, here's my zone. Here are the people I need to talk to. Here are the types of nature-based solutions that are appropriate in my area and could probably help. So it's a starting place. It's not a plan. It's a way to think about, what are my options here and how can I bring together a community to make this a community-driven landscape scale approach, which is kind of where we know we need to head one of the challenges we face here is governance. There's not an overarching governor of San Francisco Bay. It's 100 cities, it's 9 counties, lots of special districts. And so there really isn't a driver. It has to come from the ground up. And I think that's what has been powerful about that framework.
Julie, that was a fantastic description and certainly illustrates all the complexities of working in the San Francisco Bay. And I just think about all those different land uses and also, thinking about climate change and the issues that these communities are going to have to face, and thinking about continuously adapting to rising sea levels. And so having this framework for building social and ecological resilience seems like that is going to be absolutely critical.
Yeah. And Julie, I want to pick up on Jeff's point, because one of the things that's really interesting to us is how do you translate what you learned in your previous experience to what you're doing at the Corps now?
That's a great question. One of the reasons I chose to come to the Army Corps is when you look around at all the opportunities for nature-based adaptation along the shoreline, they all require sediment. If we want our marshes to keep pace with sea level rise, if we want to build ecotone levees, if we want to augment our mudflats, we need that sediment. And we have a deficit of sediment now in the Bay because of a long history, which would be a whole other podcast. So I looked around, and the Army Corps is who dredges all the sediment every year. And so a huge opportunity is how do we take that sediment that is dredged from the port of Oakland, Redwood City, Richmond, and reuse that material for marsh creation, restoration, augmentation, and to build those nature-based features that we know we need and want. And so the connection for me really is that scale of being able to work across jurisdictions that the Army Corps is able to do, and also the connection to the sediment and the dredge material and the reuse there. The other thing I'll say is, I've been focused on San Francisco Bay for a long time, but one thing that I'm really excited about is Humboldt Bay, which is another estuary in far northern California, and San Diego Bay, and all these other estuaries are starting to think about this adaptation atlas type approach. And so I've been helping them. We can help them develop these same types of toolkits and then make that connection to the dredge material that the Army Corps does across the entire West Coast. And so it's really a powerful scale to be able to work at.
Julie, that's wonderful. And you hit upon a very important point here, which is the Corps of Engineers and how we are responsible for dredging sediment across the country, really. And I think annually it's up to around 250 million cubic yards of dredged sediment. And that's a resource, as you clearly indicated. And so being able to keep that material in systems to be able to use it for the purpose of constructing natural infrastructure, things like wetlands and islands, and nourishing those types of features so that they are retained in the landscape, that's so important.
It's so neat to hear you both talking about sediment as a treasured resource. I can remember being at workshops with the Corps and other agency partners 15 years ago when that idea was kind of thrown out and people thought it was a bit bizarre.
Well, Sarah, I think climate change really changes the game.
Yeah.
And I think it's taken a while, but the idea that we can't keep doing things the way we've always done them, whether you want to or not, climate change is happening. That's and right. It requires a massive shift in everything we do, but especially in water resources and the type of management activities that we do. And so, thinking about it as a resource, thinking about it as providing benefits, and then figuring out logistically, how do you do it? How do you pay for it? How do you permit it? It is a shift.
Absolutely. It's a huge shift. It's a huge shift. I want to talk about another huge shift that's going on in your neck of the woods. I want to talk about the district becoming an engineering and nature proving grounds and what that means and why it's important, especially given that climate impacts are upon us now.
Yeah, so, the Army Corps has been using nature-based solutions and doing this type of work for a long time, but opportunistically. And there's some really great examples in San Francisco Bay. They first reused dredge sediment in the 90s at a place called Sonoma Baylands, which was really exciting. And actually, oddly, my dad was involved in that because he worked for the Longshoremen's Union way back in the 90s. And I remember him talking about how he represented the dredgers and the longshoremen, and they were doing this cool thing by reusing sediment. And so, this is like the idea of different groups working together is so amazing. And also it's not new. But what is new, I think, is this urgency around sea level rise and the recognition that marshes are so important for our adaptation and that we need the sediment. And so the idea of a proving ground is really a district that just stands up and says, we are going to institutionalize this. We've been doing this opportunistically, but we are going to institutionalize these practices into all of our projects, all of our processes. We're going to test, we're going to do pilot studies. We believe that this is the way forward, and, it can't happen everywhere, but everywhere that it can, let's try it. And it's really a culture shift. It's not that there's a lot of money. It's not that there's fame and glory. It's really like, this is something we believe in. This is part of our value system. And really it reflects the communities that we serve here in California. This is what our communities want. It's what our stakeholders want. And so it's standing up and saying, we're going to work collaboratively and really try to move the needle. It's been really wonderful to have our leadership support. I know you interviewed Brigadier General Gant, and she was our division commander and was just the most amazing inspiration and supporter of engineering with nature and the overlaps with equity and environmental justice communities, because that's how we think about it in San Francisco Bay in our proving ground, that really these are stacking benefits. If you're able to integrate nature-based solutions into communities that have been historically underserved, the benefits just skyrocket. And that's where we need to be focusing our efforts.
That was sure a key theme when we talked with Colonel Gant. She was on season 4, episode 6 of the Engineering with Nature podcast. And I think I talked to you about this when we were preparing. When we got through that interview with her, I thought I would follow that woman to the end of the earth. She was just absolutely inspiring. And I can see how becoming an Engineering with Nature proving grounds was so important for her, giving her passion for both the Engineering with Nature side as well as the social equity. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, the equity side, because it was something that we talked to her about, and it's something Jeff and I have talked about on a lot of our podcasts.
Yeah. The way that we think about it here and have been talking about it, and, Brigadier General Gant was such a huge voice and supporter in this. I would also follow her to the ends of the earth. What is that the same systems that created the inequity that we see today, redlining, racist housing policies that had communities living in the most low-lying, flood-prone areas, those kind of development patterns are some of the same patterns that wiped out all the nature that we had in those areas. And so we're sort of left with communities living below sea level without adequate flood protection, without access to parks, without access to nature. And so the idea that you can move the needle on protecting communities, working with communities, not just giving it to communities, but saying, this is a collaborative process, trying to use our position as, stewards of federal dollars to support a community vision. And those visions include marshes, access to fishing, access to recreation, as well as flood protection. And so the idea that these are separate topics, I think, kind of leads us astray. If we think about them together and trying to adapt communities equitably, nature is in the forefront of that, because not only can it provide the flood protection and adaptation potential, but it also provides so many of the benefits that communities don't have or need and want. And I think one critical piece of that is listening to communities first. And that's a huge piece of kind of our approach in the San Francisco District and across agencies and across the Corps needs to be community voices need to be at the table, tribal voices at the table first to hear what communities want and then try to realize that vision. And I think that's the way that we're going to get to this equitable place if we can.
Julie, I totally agree. And I think you hit on so many important points here. The idea of engagement with communities, doing that up front, one of the initial elements to any activity that we pursue, being able to collaborate in terms of thinking through what is needed for a community, making sure that we are inclusive, and really wanting to find opportunities for districts to embrace that engineer with nature culture as well. And so what you're doing in San Francisco District, it has a lot of meaning. And those learnings, those experiences that you're having as a proving ground, we want to be able to capture that and to be able to share it with the rest of the core enterprise. And having folks like you on the ground leading these efforts, it's essential to how we're going to be able to message and to be able to share this information across our organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Julie, maybe you could talk a little bit about the culture shift that you're leading and talk about how it's playing out in the communities in the areas that you're responsible for.
So people are so excited that work at the core when you start talking about nature-based solutions. I would say from the ground up, this is what young people are interested in. They have grown up in a world where climate change is the thing. That is what we are concerned about. And so it's not new for anyone that's under the age of 35. So it attracts people. People want to work on equitable nature-based adaptation. Those are buzzwords that are out there everywhere. They weren't 10 years ago or 5 years ago even. But now that's something that draws people to an organization. And so once you start getting a mass of people come out of the woodworks and say, oh, I've really been doing that for a long time. I've been really excited, but I was stymied by this policy or that policy. And so in a lot of ways, to me, the culture shift and the proving ground is about giving people the courage to think a little bit differently, providing a space where people feel safe throwing out new ideas or saying, what if we tried it this way? Or what if we reuse that sediment here? And it's a getting to yes mentality. That's the way we talk about it. How can we get to yes? It's much easier to say, oh, no, we can't do that. We're just going to do things the way we've always done. But getting to yes requires thinking outside the box, being vulnerable and saying, I don't know if this would work, but let's try it. Or let's just even experiment a little bit. And I think climate change gives us that urgent imperative. We have to create new tools. And so one example of that is we need new ways of reusing dredged material, going back to that. There's a lot of ways that this has been done that we know how to do, but we know we need to really bump it up a lot to meet General Spellman's goals of reusing 70% by 2030. But honestly, we want to use all of it that's possible. And we need that here for our marshes and mudflats that ring the margin of the bay. So we need to be thinking about different ideas. So we're thinking about shallow water strategic placement that had never been done in San Francisco Bay before. We just piloted that for the first time. Everyone said, no, that's not possible. The boats are going to run aground. It's too shallow. And we were like, it is going to work. And it did. We are thinking about using water injection dredging to pulse sediment out of streams because a lot of sediment is stuck in flood control channels that don't get dredged very often. So how can you use the power of nature to pulse it out as it would have done historically? So we're piloting these different new ideas that, they're not radical, but they haven't been done here before. And I think that's part of the culture shift. It's like, let's try new things. Let's prove to ourselves that they can work, but also adjust them when they don't work.
Julie, can I pick up on that and ask you to explain what using dredged materials in shallow bays means and why it's so cool?
So we had the opportunity to try and to pilot using dredged material and placing it in the shallows as opposed to bringing it all the way to the marsh. It's pretty expensive to directly place material. And this way, we're kind of taking the sediment part of the way and then letting water do the work for the rest of the way. So we're using the power of tides, wind waves, and currents to move that material once it gets placed in the shallows. And we're targeting mudflats and marshes that need that sediment, but it also is just keeping sediment in the system. And so we just piloted that in the month of December, and we're monitoring it now. We placed 90,000 cubic yards offshore of a large restoration project. And now we're monitoring the way that that sediment moves from the shallows to the mudflat to the marsh. We're using magnetic tracers, which is a new monitoring technique for us in San Francisco Bay, which is super exciting. And there's a lot of different parts of the puzzle, but it's pretty exciting to try a new type of beneficial use in this region.
Yeah. Now that sounds like a proving ground, doesn't it, Sarah? That is a proving ground.
Yeah. And we are going to want to know how it works and what kind of benefits you're able to see accruing from the sediment as it disperses the way it should disperse through water.
Well, and Sarah, I want to pick up on something here. Julie shared with us one really exciting project that's underway, but there are many excellent engineering with nature projects in San Francisco District. And I wanted to see if maybe we could get Julie to talk a little bit more about others that are incorporating nature-based solutions and how you, Julie, are working with communities to adapt to climate change and helping them to become more resilient. And the project I had in mind was the Guadalupe River Project. If you could maybe tell our audience a little bit about that.
Yes, thanks, Jeff. So the Guadalupe River runs through the very dense city of San Jose, California, which is the heart of Silicon Valley. And it is a classic urban stream that has development right up to the edge of it. It also supports steelhead, which are an endangered salmonid species here in California. So we had an opportunity to try to help the community be more resilient from flooding. But this is a project that has been studied and in the works at the Army Corps for over 20 years. The solution that people had come to in the past without an engineering with nature lens was a bypass, a concrete bypass that just took half the river and put it in another trapezoidal channel that ran parallel to the main channel. But that didn't pass muster for a lot of reasons. The velocities were too high. The communities didn't like it. It's sort of dangerous. And so we had an opportunity to look at it again. And we took an engineering with nature lens to it and thought, okay, we have a little bit of space here because they had planned to build this bypass channel. So we thought, what could we do with that space? And the whole tenet of engineering with nature is how can you give the river more room? How can you let water do the work? If you let it spread out, slow down, then you have lower velocities and you have better habitat. And so we came up with a plan that included a fairly large floodplain, an inset floodplain. So this is an urban stream, but if you have space, you can still set the banks back and kind of excavate down a floodplain, which is reminiscent of how that channel used to connect to its floodplain before it had kind of sunk down. And that provided the flood benefits that we needed to pass through this area, but it also allowed a lot more space for an enhanced riparian corridor, salmonid habitat, more successional patterns along those edges. And it really became a win-win because the biggest win here was that it saved the project $350 million. And so that was a really great moment when we realized not only is this better for the environment, it's better for the communities, but it also saves a lot of money. And that's hard sometimes because some of these projects are new, and so they do wind up costing more. But this was an example where a tried and true method of a floodplain. Rivers connect to floodplains. That's what they do. When they connect to floodplains, water slows down and spreads out. And so it's really kind of a first principles approach that integrates into a flood risk management project.
Wonderful. That is fantastic to hear, and want to learn more about that over the years too. So we'll have to have you back to tell us more, give us some updates on what the community thinks of this project.
Anytime. One thing about the community is what they were really interested in was access and recreation. And so one thing that this floodplain does is it connects a set of trails that previously had just stopped on either side of the study area. And so we're able to integrate recreational trails
Fantastic.
through the floodplain, which is another great benefit of giving the river more room.
Wow, Julie, that sounds great. And then from my understanding, there are many different partners that are also associated with this project as well. Can you offer our listeners a little bit more on how those partners are interacting with one another?
Sure. So the Valley Water is the partner that's the non-federal sponsor, and they're the flood control and sort of stewardship and water supply group. But we've also been working with the cities of San Jose, the parks districts, the tribes. And one thing that I want to highlight is how important it is for us to work, well, for everyone, but what we really put an emphasis on is working with the tribal communities in these areas. And so there's a lot of active tribes who are interested in this area for their lifeways. And so one of the things that we're incorporating into the plan is how can we use the space that we've created to plant species that are important for tribes and their culture. How can they access them? Can we have signage? This is an area where there were a lot of communities that lived and still live in this area, and it's often really buried. And so how can we bring that to life and to make it more known, make it more accessible for communities? Previously, this part of the channel was completely cut off and fenced on either side. And so we're trying to really work with the tribes and with the cities to open it up.
Julie, that's such an amazing benefit for the communities, especially the tribes. What a really great initiative. But I know you've also faced some difficult challenges.
One challenge I'll say is that there's a housing issue in San Francisco Bay, as there is in many parts of the country. And so there's a lot of people who are living in the floodway, which has also been a challenge from a life safety perspective. So we've worked really closely with some of the housing organizations to think about how can we make sure that the people living in the channels right now are taken care of and have a different place to go that's safer.
Wow. Incredibly complex, Julie. Really is.
It's such a great example of all of the principles of engineering with nature, all working seamlessly, working with your partners, working on new technologies, bringing new ideas to the table, and really creating something that will continue to adapt to the needs of the different communities. It's just a fabulous project, Julie. We'll make sure that we put the links in the show notes. Before we let you go, we want to talk about what's ahead for you. And more importantly, I think we're really interested in hearing, what do you want to accomplish personally? You chose the Corps. What do you want to accomplish in your work?
That's a great question, Sarah. What I want to accomplish, and I think what a lot of folks, and I have to say this is a huge team effort in San Francisco District and across the Corps. There are so many amazing people pushing the envelope in so many ways. And that gives us all strength to keep going together. But what I want to accomplish is that nature-based solutions are not a special thing. It's not a buzzword. It's just part of the fabric of the way we do business. It is, a piece of the puzzle. It doesn't require policy waivers or extra monitoring. It's just part of how we do things. That would be a success to me, is if every project just said, here are the options on the table, and how can using nature-based solutions help us get to all those benefits? If everyone had that worked into their just fiber of their being, that's what I want to accomplish. And I think we're really getting there in San Francisco. It's become something that people think about regularly, but that's my goal.
Well, Julie, I just want to just parrot back what I heard you say, and I want this to be something that we use time and time again. Nature-based solutions become part of the fabric. And to your point, integrated into all of our project decision-making. And this gets back to what we were talking about, that idea of real culture change. And your example is such a testimony to inviting young people to consider the Corps of Engineers for a career, and thinking through the differences that they can make, just like you did, Julie, just like you are doing, because that's the kind of interest, the enthusiasm, the energy that the Corps really needs. And to be able to have you on our podcast to share your example, I am very, very hopeful that we'll have graduate students listening to this podcast, and they're going to say, I want to follow in Julie's footsteps.
I totally agree, Jeff. I want to follow in Julie's footsteps. Jeez. It's just so interesting to me that, the things that you've talked about, Julian, how in the time that I've been working with the Corps, which has been over 15 years, how some things like beneficial use of sediment is becoming second nature. I think it's going to be a much shorter time frame until your goal is achieved and nature-based solutions are not even considered, something extra, that they're just, to your point, part of the fabric of how we do everything. We always think about them. And the idea that you've got new people coming into the district, but also to the Army Corps of Engineers generally, that want to change things, want to think differently, and have all these new skills. And that's just fantastic. So, wow, thank you for inspiring Jeff and I.
That's right.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to share. It's, this is the tip of the iceberg. I'm so proud of our district. And again, it's not just me. It's, you get strength in numbers. And I think that's something that I feel really proud of for San Francisco District in particular.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's a great team out there. No can deny. That's a wonderful group of people to be working with. And Julie, thank you. Thank you for being on our podcast today.
Well, thanks so much for the honor. It really was an honor.
Well, we think that your story and your passion for engineering with nature and nature-based solutions is just absolutely illuminating and certainly inspiring. And to Jeff's point, I hope it really resonates with students and people that are early in their careers. It's them and it's you and your leadership that really can make a difference. And as you said, climate change is upon us. We have to think differently. So thank you for being on our show, Jeff. Thank you for recommending we have Julie. She was a great guest.
Well, I knew she'd knock it out of the park, and that absolutely happened today.
Oh, thanks.
We'll make sure that we have you back again, Julie, and you can tell us how some of these projects are working out.
I would love that.
Great. And to all of you, thank you so much for listening. We hope that you've enjoyed this podcast, and we hope that you'll join us again when we talk about engineering with nature.
You've been listening to the EWN podcast, developed by Sarah Thorne and Jeff King, National Lead, Engineering with Nature Initiative, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Now, for more information, you can visit our website, engineeringwithnature.org. The EWN podcast is produced by Eye Contact Productions for the Engineering with Nature program within the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm Dave Trafford.